Good morning. We are so delighted to welcome people from around the country to this book talk featuring Aspen Family Prosperity Innovation Community Advisor, Dr. Rohini Anand, in conversation with Aspen's Vice President for People and Culture, Maisha Forbes. Dr. Anand's book, Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, is a powerful roadmap for how organizations can make systemic change. I'm Sarah Haight. I'm the Associate Director for Network and Outreach at Ascend. And I'm speaking to you this morning from just outside Washington, D.C., on the ancestral land of the Piscataway and Nanocheng tribes. If you'd like to learn more about the ancestral land on which you are living or working today, you can click on the link we will put in the chat. We will be recording this book talk and sharing the recording on our website by early next week. We'll also have time for a Q&A towards the end of the conversation, so please feel free to share questions in the chat, or you can follow us on Twitter at AspenAscend, where we'll be inviting questions there as well. And now I'm pleased to introduce our Executive Director and Aspen Institute Vice President, Ann Mosley, to share a few leadership remarks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And just thank you all for making time to join in on this, what I know will be a truly powerful and energizing and concrete conversation around leading global diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have the great gift of Dr. Rohini Anand, who is the author and also longstanding leader in the private sector from her roles at Sodexo through many other boards and affiliations, as well as a national advisor to the Aspen Institute Ascend Family Prosperity Innovation Community, to share her expertise and insights and also concrete examples around what does equity inclusion look like at a pragmatic and systemic level to truly operationalize and embody equity and inclusion alongside our own Maisha Forbes as Vice President of People, Talent, and Culture, and bringing her longstanding experience from within the Institute, but even more broadly, for this incredibly important conversation that Dan Porterfield in a moment will also share his leadership remarks. A few grounding comments I just wanted to share from the Ascend at the Aspen Institute perspective was this talk was really inspired from the work of the Family Prosperity Innovation Community, which has been a multi-year partnership with more than 20 frontline innovative organizations that span all sectors and a prestigious and unpredictable, beautiful cohort of national advisors that really together came together with the kind of two seminal kind of questions and opportunities. One was really at this moment in time, how do we look at economic mobility alongside health and well-being in an integrated, more whole way that is truly grounded in equity and inclusion, and especially racial equity, and also thinking about the role of parents, caregivers, and families. We're all living in times that are complicated and complex. And while we have been addressing and experiencing as it's called by many, the reckoning of the pandemics, COVID, racial inequity, and injustice, this is truly an urgent time of profound transformation and opportunity to live into and create the world that we've been longing for. And so as we have the conversation, I encourage us to be thinking about broadly around equity and inclusion grounded in racial, justice and equity, economic, gender, cultural. When we think about the power of values and principles to guide us in this time of transformation, to bring in our hearts, our minds, our beliefs, our identities, alongside the power of our influence, our positions, our organizations, our institutions, to embed and create the kind of change we make. The Aspen Institute, our legacy around values-based leadership in service of a free and just and equitable society, The opportunity to bring these values to life in profoundly new ways is exciting to us all, I know. And when we also think about the wisdom of change happens at the pace of relationships and trust. We all know trust at a societal and structural level is at an all-time low. Yet one of the bright spots, there's still room for upward numbers to grow, but around 61% say that businesses are some of the most trusted voices in this time of transformation and turbulence. And so for the work of Ascend and specifically the Family Prosperity Innovation community, there's been a lot of deep intentional work to look at what are principles for employers to be thinking about and advancing and actually adopting to advance equity and inclusion, and also ensure that we think about the roles and the talents and the assets of parents and caregivers and families very deliberately in that equation. So you'll hear more about that as we go forward, especially at the end from my colleague, Marjorie Sims. But for now, I think it is time to really get into the heart of the conversation. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dan Porterfield, our CEO of the Aspen Institute, who we know has a deep, longstanding, and very specific commitment to the importance of bringing these values to life, not only to all of us within the Aspen Institute, but to all those that we partner with, we learn from, to inspire and to activate and ignite the kind of change we like to see make possible. So Dan, it's my pleasure to, and my gratitude to say thank you for making the time to be with us and share a bit of your insights and why this work is so important that you have been working to make come to life in very profound and pragmatic and powerful ways for the Institute. So Dan, thank you, and thank you for making the time to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Ann, and thank you everybody for being here. Definitely my pleasure to welcome you all. And part of what Ann is alluding to is that my mom was a single mother in Baltimore who went to college in her 30s while raising me and my sister. And so we really lived that two-gen life, if you will. And she had grown up in foster care, and we had my sister and me, a lot more opportunities in our lives, a lot better life because of my mom, but also the institutions in Baltimore that supported her, the family that supported her, and the way she then set the stage for us. So Ascend is incredibly important to me, and such a leadership organization, a network that's so powerful. So thank you all for being here. And just a little bit in following where Sarah started, everybody can take a moment to acknowledge wherever you are today. And we're gathering from all around the country. Here again in DC, we recognize the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank, the Piscataway, the Pamunkey peoples. And in Aspen, we recognize the Ute when we are convening there on our campus. So much to learn still, and so much more to learn about our heritage together and what more we can do actively to support justice for Indigenous communities all around the country and around the world. And Ascend is a part of that. Ascend is part of the Aspen Institute, which is this nonprofit organization. It's committed to realizing a more free, just, and equitable society. And we work to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion through a variety of policy and public programs, including Ascend, which is such a catalyst and convener for systems, policy, social impact leaders working to create a world where every family, like mine growing up, is able to pass a legacy of economic and educational success and well-being from one generation to the next. I just love that mission, and I love the framing of assets around which we do our work, and the co-creation with the communities and families that we are seeking to support and to help and to love. I'd like to thank Ann and Marjorie and Sarah and Lexi and the whole team for their leadership of Ascend, and for putting their minds and bodies and hearts in motion for change, as Dr. King urged us to do, for a brighter future for children and families. Ascend launched phase 2 of the Aspen Family Prosperity Innovation Community in July of 2020 with this accelerated focus that Ann spoke of on the role of employers in advancing family supportive policies for workers with low incomes. How important, how incredible that we're all working on this together. I love it. And over the last 2 years, this cohort of 20 community-based and national policy organizations, and then 14 cross-sector advisors, so a lot of talent in the network, have come together to try to start to reimagine with families, co-creating more effective systems and structures for social and economic mobility, and which is all about unlocking the greatness in our communities, our people, our children, our parents, so that there's more prosperity, more equity, more inclusion, more community, a better and stronger social fabric for all. We are, of course, all interdependent. And a great area of focus for the family prosperity innovation community has been engaging the employers to sign on to Ascend's 4 employer principles for family prosperity. And I love, again, this way of driving change by finding concepts people can opt into in order to then do work in their community, in their company, in their region that advances the common good with a focus on equity and on the group that we're trying to make sure gets every opportunity for lives in the economic, social mainstream. So these principles really are a roadmap for employers to achieve a vision of good jobs, family-sustaining jobs, jobs that support the dignity we believe all people have and share for all parents, but especially our focus, those with low incomes. And then to advance this work, we're excited to be gathering the group together today for a book talk with Dr. Rohini Anand and her new book, Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a guide for systemic change in multinational organizations. The book covers 5 big and proven principles for organizations to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion with a nuanced understanding, how critical, of local contexts across countries and cultures. So I'm really honored to be able to introduce the speakers, and thank you, Ann and Marjorie, for inviting me to do the introduction. Dr. Anand, and now I'm going to call her Rohini because she told me to, is a recognized pioneer in diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's been on the forefront of leading lasting change for organizations worldwide. I love the worldwide aperture here. And Rohini is an active advisor for the innovation community, and it's been an integral collaborator for us in the development of the 4 employer principles for family prosperity. She's a trusted board member, a high impact author, esteemed speaker, and Rohini's, the strategic thinking, the ability to influence and coach senior leaders, and the depth of your experience in global DEI have benefited organizations in their global diversity and inclusion transformation, a journey that you've been on for a long time. I know we're going to learn a lot from. And Rohini was previously Senior Vice President for Corporate Responsibility and Global Chief Diversity Officer for Sodexo. Under her leadership, the Sodexo brand became synonymous with leadership in diversity, corporate responsibility, and wellness. Now, moderating this discussion will be my colleague and partner, Maisha Renee Forbes, who is our Vice President for People and Culture. It's been in this role for a little more than a year. She oversees all of our internal talent, human resources, people, functions, and strategy and thinking. And she's leading the processes and structures that ensure that we really have the leadership, recruitment, talent development practices, and culture in place to achieve our mission of driving towards a free, just, and equitable society, doing our work in the world and our work in the organization in a way where those values align. She's an incredible leader. Over the course of her career, she has helped a number of different private and public organizations improve their overall employee experience in ways that reflect the values and culture of the organization, and of course the values that Maisha herself embodies, which is towards Dr. King's vision of a beloved society, a beloved community. And I know so many different organizational leaders that have worked with her over the years. It's my privilege to work with her so closely now here. So thank you all for joining us. I'm very happy to pass it on to Maisha and Rohini.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you. I will say, I know I am thrilled to be here today. I am actually dialing in from right outside Atlanta in the North Atlanta suburbs on the ancestral lands of the Cherokee and the Yuchi tribal peoples. And I am just so honored actually to be here with you, Rohini. You're allowing me to call you Rohini for Dr. Anand as well. And I'm looking so forward to our conversation and to just learning more about you and just hearing more from you. We can get started with the questions unless you want to start with anything, Rohini.
Well, thank you so much, Maisha, and thank you, Dan, thank you, Anne, thank you, Marjorie and Sarah and Lexi for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm dialing in today from Maryland, from the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people. I actually just absolutely love the way the Family Prosperity Group introduces itself. So I think this should be a role model for everyone. And for those that are from corporations that have signed into and dialed into this talk, I would encourage you to take a look at the 4 principles that Anne talked about. They're really holistic, and I think there are sort of principles that every employer should be signing on to. So, and looking forward to the conversation with you, Maisha.
Thank you very much, Rohini. I'm going to start with a question around kind of what's your story. I think you and I both know how powerful stories are in our work in DEI, and everyone has a DEI story. So I would love for you to share with us what brought you to DEI, what brought you to the work that you do in this space.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Everyone has a story, and particularly in this DEI space, this work is very personal for anyone who's doing this work. It has to be very personal. And my story is integral to who I am. So, I grew up in Mumbai, and growing up in Mumbai, India, everyone pretty much looked like me with the same skin tones. I belonged to the majority religion. And surrounded by others like me, I actually had the privilege of not having to think about my identity. It was when I moved to the US, Maisha, as a young, single Indian woman, that was my inflection point in both my literal and my metaphorical journey. And my identity shifted from being a person who saw herself as the center of the world to being a minority, to being an immigrant, to being a foreigner. And I was honestly completely unprepared for that. So it was only when I was identified as a minority did I realize some of the privileges that came with being part of a majority. I was part of a majority growing up in India, and I hadn't recognized my privilege in that way. And I was honestly unable to till I was perceived as a minority, and I experienced things differently. So, this realization of what it means to be a minority, part of a non-dominant group, this sort of realization that identity is situational, that it's fluid, still informs my work. And this vocation is very personal to me. And, I think that understanding what it means to be perceived as a minority, an outsider, is very much at the heart of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So my work is about leveling the playing field so everyone can succeed. And I would say that my vocation and my avocation are perfectly aligned. So, that's my story. It's, part of who I am and why I do this work.
Thank you very much, Rohini. I have to say, that's one thing that I really am enjoying and enjoyed about the book is the way you infuse so much of your personal story and your personal journey. And the part about being when you were in India and everyone, you were of the majority. And it makes me think a little bit about how we talk about belonging now. So a lot of people, they add the B after the DEI, right? And belonging is not something you think about per se when everyone it looks like you or is from the same background or the same, fill in the blank. And how do we as practitioners think about helping people to feel like they belong when they are experiencing some kind of otherness or they are have an other identity that is not the majority. But I appreciate the way you draw on that personal story of yours in that way. So thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit also about organizations and some of the things that organizations struggle with. Organizations we struggle with ensuring that our culture, our organizational culture is diverse, it's inclusive, it's equitable in a sustained way. And so this is really, I think, the heart of your book and also the heart of your life's work in this space. And just so, we really get out the meat early on in our conversation, tell us, what does it take? What does it take for organizations to ensure that their organizational culture is diverse, inclusive, and equitable in a sustainable way?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, I'll talk about it in a minute, but I did want to share with you, Maisha, one sort of additional piece around, my story. So when I joined Sodexo, this was sort of early in my career. And I joined at a time when the company had some litigation, and I didn't realize the seriousness of that litigation till it was actually certified as a class action lawsuit. It was a lawsuit filed by African Americans. It was a promotion discrimination lawsuit. And sort of extending this piece around my identity, here I was, I was hired to be the chief diversity officer. My role was to change that, the lawsuit predated me, etc. But I was extremely conscious of my Asian American identity. Here I was, with African American leaders, and I really started questioning the wisdom of the organization and hiring somebody who was not of their like identity in order to address some of the issues, because I had had my share of discrimination, being told, go back to where you belong, you speak English well, all of those things. But I had not had the experiences of my Black colleagues in the potent context of enslavement, historical enslavement in the United States. So it was, my job to sort of listen to their lived experiences, to build trust with them, while at the same time building trust with management and, sort of building my relationship with them, but doing it in a way such that, my Black colleagues trusted me enough to be my sort of sounding board, to be my guides, and to really help me to navigate some of the things that they were experiencing. So I just wanted to extend that, identity in my story. I should have said it earlier before you asked me the next question. But I think this is so much a part of that identity and how it's situational and how it's fluid and how it's contextual. And, sometimes you are a majority, sometimes you're a minority, but you really have to do that introspection and recognize the privileges that come with being, part of certain groups, whether it's based on race or ethnicity or gender or socioeconomic class, or sexual orientation. So, but going to your next question, I don't know. If
Wait. I have a response.
Yes,
I will say, I have to say, in the book, when you talked about that and feeling like you were doubtful that maybe they should have hired someone who was, different or who maybe an African American to do this work, I thought to myself, wow, was that the beginning of imposter? Was that a little bit of imposter syndrome setting in? Was that the doubt that I think so many of us professionals feel? I will go ahead and say, particularly women in this space doing this work, wondering, am I the right person to carry this torch? Am I the right person to do this work? So I just want to thank you again for sharing that personal lesson with us.
That's a great point. Very good point. I think we do tend to do that, particularly women of color. And I'm sure there was a lot of that going on, for me as well. So appreciate you calling that out. Thank you. But you were talking about, go ahead, Maisha.
I was going to say now to my question, and I'm happy to repeat it if you need to.
So, I think, the piece is that, this work is complex, it's very dynamic, and there's really no sort of checklist or playbook. And honestly, as I was sharing before we started this call, best practices are not enough, because best practices are at a moment in time, right? And it's easy for these best practices to dissolve overnight without intentionality. So it really is a best practice in one given moment in time that is sort of, a practice that we can learn from. But they're not fixed, they're not permanent, there's no cookbook. So these sort of 5 things that I found in doing my work time and time again with multiple organizations, that, I call them principles because they basically provide a through line for how to do diversity, equity, and inclusion, and racial justice work. And each sort of principle is a very simple statement. It has my experience as well as the anecdotes and experiences of many, many colleagues. They're simple, but they're disruptive. They don't provide standards and don't provide plug and play templates on what's worked in one country or in one organization. I mean, you have to understand an organizational culture to know how to take those principles and then apply them in different organizational cultures. And, the foundational mistake very often is, oh, this thing works over here, so it's going to work in this organization. Or, works in this country, it's going to work in it doesn't work that way. It has to be applied with sensitivity to organizational cultures in single country, in single countries, as well as across cultures and countries. But what these principles do is sort of empower leaders to develop their own solutions without mimicking any one person's or organization's experience. And it requires that you sort of draw on these multiple cultural frameworks to really make it work and make it relevant. So let me just quickly share the 5 principles. The first is what I call make it local. And this principle is really about the fact that global DI change has to be anchored in an understanding of the local context. It has to be rooted in the local particulars, informed by the history, the culture, the language, the laws. Not only in global organizations, but across organizational cultures, in single country organizations with regional nuances, for instance, in the US. And one has to consider how identity is defined, how it's expressed, how it's perceived, the power dynamics and structures, the dominant and subordinate groups. And understanding the context is really the first step in finding the strategies that help to advance underrepresented groups. And honestly, Maisha, it doesn't mean accepting the status quo. So understanding the context is not about accepting the status quo. It's about being a catalyst for change, and sometimes using an outside sort of influence to be a catalyst for change, raising issues that people within a culture may not see, may not be able to raise because they're charged or because of power dynamics. So, but what happens is that I think it works best when local change agents are empowered to find the right entry points, ensure relevance. And in the case of Ascend Family Prosperity, it's a great example, because centering and empowering the families that are impacted is the only way to do this work. You can't come in with sort of a cookie cutter approach. It's asking the families that are impacted about how we can support them. So that's really what this first principle is about. The second is what I call leaders change to lead change. And we just know, and having worked in so many organizations, that senior leadership commitment is absolutely fundamental to ensuring that diversity, equity, and inclusion, racial justice is sustained. And when leaders embrace this DEI work with authentic purpose and passion, organizations go from performative action to really sustainable progress. But in order to do that, and there are many leaders on this call today, leaders really need to internalize the benefit to themselves and to the organization. And this sometimes takes a disruption in worldview, a change that happens very often with sort of painful work of introspection. And the disruption of worldview can happen with data and facts, but very often takes place with experiences and stories, because ultimately humans are emotional beings, and behavior and decisions are largely influenced by emotions. So often it's about the lived experiences of discrimination shared with the dominant group by those that have had these lived experiences. And I just think the leaders need to be mindful of the toll that it takes for people to share their lived experiences again and again sometimes, and we should really maximize each story, and leaders need to take ownership of their own learning. So transformative leaders, which is critical, that's that second principle, right? Combine inclusive mindsets and behaviors with concrete actions. And personal behavior demonstrates a conviction, but taking action really signals commitment. And it requires intentionality to focus on racial justice, on diversity, equity, and inclusion, as they would with any other sort of business imperative or mission-driven imperative. The third, very quickly, is what I call, and it's good business too. So without a compelling sort of change rationale, 70% of efforts fail, change efforts fail. And diversity, equity, and inclusion work cannot be siloed. It cannot be bolted on. It must be congruent with the organization's purpose and how business is done, as well as the sort of geographic and regional trends. The third is go deep, wide, and inside out. And this is about the fact that diversity, equity, and inclusion can't be really seen as we're doing this as a series of activities. Organizations are really comprised of interconnected systems that work in concert with each other. And this work has to be infused within all of the processes and policies and structures. We have to take a systems approach, which is what I know you're doing at Aspen. It has to become part of how day-to-day business is done. It has to be embedded wide through governance structures, scaling them, deep through change agents and allies, and inside out by integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion, racial justice into the external and internal ecosystem. And then lastly, know what matters and count it is the fifth principle. And this is about simply, having the right metrics that spotlight problem areas and possible solutions and the instruments for change, but also holding teams accountable. So these are sort of the 5 principles that I have found critical in doing racial justice work, in doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, because they provide this sort of a container, a framework to doing this work. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Rohini. I would say I have lots of reactions. I'm going to go on to the next question, but I just wanted to highlight 2 things. One, because I know there's a lot of practitioners on the call, a lot of folks who are either practitioners by title or by, by name in their organizations, or folks who are doing this work because it's important to them. And by virtue of their role, they're just doing it because they know that someone needs to take this on. And I would say 2 things, everything you said makes so much sense. And that's one thing I love about the book as well. It's so relevant. Everything is so practical and relevant. And it's like, it's an aha moment, like how you put it all together. But 2 things you said. One was you were giving the example about, involving the families, as with the Family Prosperity Initiative. You ask the families, right? Ask those who are, all too often we want to sit in a room and want to create something and then kind of do it unto someone, right? We want to roll it out to someone who's going to be impacted, but it's never going to work unless you go to the source, unless you go to the folks on the ground who are going to be receiving that. Otherwise, it's DEI being done onto them, whether that's a junior staff person, whether that's someone who, maybe not in a decision-making room, but they're kind of a recipient of the work, or someone in the community. It has to be done in partnership. And I just want to highlight that as a key thing I know works in helping some of these initiatives roll out that so many of us are working on. And then the second thing was just, you said leaders need to take ownership of their own learning. I won't say much about that, but I just wanted to say it out loud again, because I think it's something that sometimes we question how far we should push on that. But I do believe it to be true that leaders need to take ownership for their own learning. It is the only way that the organization will continue to move and grow in a forward-thinking manner. So thank you very much for those principles that you so carefully laid out for us. I'm wondering if you can give us some examples as you think about people, doing this work, who are examples of success stories. Can you share some examples of leaders who have disrupted their worldview and, it emerged as inclusive and transformative leaders in this space?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there's some comments and questions along those lines as well, Maisha. So I think, that's a very relevant question. So let me give you just a couple of examples from my experience in organizations. So I'll give you 2 sort of quick examples. One is a French leader, and so the French have a very different understanding of race than in the United States, and it comes from their historical context, World War II, the Holocaust. They actually don't gather data on race. It's, the word race was struck out of the Constitution in 2018 in France. And, there's a lot of sort of nuances to it. But the idea was that, that the French is a universalistic society, and whether that's true or not, obviously leaves much to be desired. But this particular leader, when I talked about issues of race in the organization and addressing it, he said to me, gender is what we can measure globally, race we cannot. So why are we focused on it? And I realized at that point in time that he needed to, be on his own journey and basically expose himself to some aspects of race that maybe had not been part of his experience. So he actually attended a all-Black meeting, the employee resource group, and they had a meeting in Texas. He was one of the only white men in the room, certainly one of the maybe two French men in the room. And he listened to the lived experiences of primarily African-American men. So they had simulated a barber shop and a beauty parlor, and there were these fireside chats. It was beautifully done.
I love
So
that.
yeah, isn't that wonderful? So that's where stories are shared, right? So he sat there and he listened to these stories, and he came away after that and he said he sent the most heartfelt message in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, which I don't know if he would have done. But he came away, basically having listened to these stories, and it really was transformative for him. And the other experience that was transformative, so it was the lived stories of the Black men in the room that he listened to and really internalized and listened without judgment, but truly listened. And it was courageous of them to share these stories that were incredibly painful, obviously. And then the other piece was he was a minority in this room. He was one of the few white men, and I don't think he had been in that situation before. And he realized, it was a new experience for him, very disruptive. So with that disruptive experience, he actually then went on his own journey of learning and, sort of sent this message and really became a true champion. So that's sort of one example, one story. I'll share another, quick one, actually two, if you don't mind, around gender. So this again, this was an individual, a senior leader who was not convinced. We had the business case, there was sort of data to demonstrate the correlation between gender balanced teams and financial outcomes, as many organizations do, etc. But he wanted to sort of network with other CEOs. He wanted to kind of, and so what I did was got him involved in networking with like-minded, CEOs committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Through the process, he mentored a woman from a different company. This was a cross-company mentoring program that he became part of along with these CEOs. He mentored this woman who was in a different organization. She got laid off. And when she got laid off, they had developed a trusting relationship, and she shared with him some of her lived experiences of being the only woman in the C-suite, being marginalized, being discriminated against. And, he came to me afterwards and he said, I just don't believe that women have these experiences, even such senior women in this organization, in these organizations. I want every single one of my leadership team to mentor a woman from a different part of the organization. So it's sort of that kind of disruption that has to happen, because ultimately change happens at the intersection of systems. We have to have those systems changes and people, and it's work that's ongoing. So we've got to also, move leaders along and move their ecosystem of beliefs on this topic along as well. And they have to take responsibility for doing that themselves. But that's, another example. And this, one of the leaders actually attended a session where, was a facilitated session where women, senior leaders in the group, it was a question that was asked, have you ever been marginalized, discriminated against, harassed? It was a string of words. And every one of those women, 6 of them in that room, very senior executives, stood up in a nanosecond. And the jaw of some of the men just fell open. I mean, it was just, not part of their experience. So, it's this sort of piece that can cause disruption. The class action lawsuit that I referenced, Maisha, the CEO at the time, he had been a sponsor of the African-American Employee Resource Group, and he attended a meeting with them. And I talk about this in the book. And they asked him a bunch of questions about his commitment, his conviction. And he came away from that meeting just angry. He said, he was a tough guy. He said, how can they ask me these questions? I'm the CEO. With reflection, with introspection, with experiences, he then went back into the meeting a couple of weeks later. I think it was, a month or so later. And as we started this conversation, he said to them, he said, I have not lived your experiences. Can you share with me? I have not walked in your shoes. Can you share your experiences with me? It was that sort of opening that created this level of trust. He was an authentic guy. When he didn't believe in something, he was, angry, he would show it. When he did believe, he would show it. And it was with that sponsorship and support of the Black leaders in the organization that I think he was able to really turn the culture around or lead this culture transformation. And then he replicated it for his team. So, those are some of the kinds of transformative experiences, but I think leaders, have to take ownership for it and be open. So let me stop there.
Thank you. It segues nicely to another question I had around how do leaders build their muscle for inclusion? And besides putting themselves in positions where they are experiencing that disruption, that kind of jarring out of the box, like very different, kind of experience in the moment, how do they really flex their muscle for inclusion and get better at it? We know that it's difficult it's difficult to create inclusion. It's also difficult to measure it of all the letters in our DEIB. But how would you say leaders can do that better?
Yeah, I think in order to really move, as I've said, from, sort of situationally driven efforts to those that are more permanent and more sustainable, leaders really do have to build their inclusion muscle. And I think there's sort of a couple of things. One is that leaders need to reflect on their ecosystem of beliefs. We all have an ecosystem of beliefs, and particularly around this particular topic, it's very personal, it's very emotional. And they've got to do the difficult work of introspection to understand what their belief system is, acknowledge the unconscious biases that they have, make themselves vulnerable. And it's with that awareness that they can seek out experiences to open and shift their mindsets, in order to internalize the benefit to themselves. And they can expand their worldview by, mentoring, sponsoring people different from themselves, underrepresented groups, women, men of color, LGBTQ employees, people with disabilities, mentor and sponsor those that are different from themselves. I think they can put themselves out of their comfort zone and seek experiences where they might be a minority. So whether it's attending, participating, attending community events, employee resource groups, I think that being a minority, being in that situation can be very, very sort of just disruptive for people. And it sort of, puts themselves out of the comfort zone that does make them think and become conscious of their own identity. I mean, I've been on both sides of this, right? I said I was a majority growing up in India. I didn't think about my identity till I was that minority. So I think, that's the other thing. They can listen to lived experiences, but I do think that has to be, done with caution, just because of the toll it takes. Conversations with their peers, who see the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Maisha, we talk about employees feeling a sense of belonging to an organization, but there is this other piece, which is a cohort of organizations that are sort of leaders in this space. And other organizations and leaders want to belong to that cohort of organizations. And that's a great sort of incentive for leaders to open their minds and to talk to other leaders who get it and who can bring them along. Also the humility to learn, by reading, by, articles, having conversations, movies on this topic. And then one thing I found very effective is when leaders step up to sponsor employee resource groups in organizations that they're not comfortable with. I think it can be a real, accelerator because they learn a lot through the process. And it can bring them along. So I think that's the second. And just quickly on the third is, once they've done this, then, sort of thought about things, introspective, sort out experiences. And I think they have to build their muscle, have to communicate the benefit of diversity, equity, and inclusion to the organization. So replicate these experiences for their team. Like I said, the CEO did, after his conversation with the African American Leadership Group, he had his team have similar conversations. They need to communicate the rationale, the why to the organization. I think that's very important, whether it's aligned with the mission, whether it's part of the business, whatever it is. In order for us, Ascend Family Prosperity, to do our work better, we've got to address racial equity, both within the organization as well as within the community. Then I think they need to integrate their commitment into all of their communications and also make themselves vulnerable by sharing their own journey. And I think that can make a leader more authentic, because not all of us, have arrived there right from the start. So what is it that helped their journey? And I think that's important. And then the fourth thing I'd say is to hold teams accountable. They have to make their expectations critically clear, crystal clear. They have to have targets for leaders. They have to measure the outcomes like they would with any other thing. They have to hold their teams accountable through the performance management process or whatever it is, whatever evaluation. How is my team member doing in racial justice in the work that they're doing, both with the team and with the community? And then, they have to embed it in the internal and external ecosystem. So examine their processes so that they have no bias, whether it's, recruiting or development, embed it beyond the talent system into their strategy, into their mission, into their outreach and communications. And then lastly, sort of engage external stakeholders. So I'm going to stop there. That was a lot.
Thank you. No, it was all great and very helpful. I hope people are taking some notes because this is great. I need to shift to take questions, but I'm going to sneak in one last question and we can maybe answer it very briefly, although I'm sure it could warrant a longer answer. But, for those of you who are doing this work, this question is for you. DEI work can be personally taxing, both emotionally, mentally, physically, especially for practitioners living at the intersection of race and gender. As a woman of color, Rohini, leading global equity and inclusion, how have you sustained yourself personally?
Yeah, it's emotional work because it goes to the core of people's identity. There's a lot of resistance that you're battling every single day. It takes creativity, it takes fortitude, it takes resilience, it takes grit. So for those that are doing this work, it's tiring work. I would say there are a couple of things that I, sort of frequently tell myself when I encounter resistance. I try not to take it personally, although it's hard not to because of my own identity. I think Dorothy Hayden, I think you can see the picture of her behind me in my room, right? She wore these incredible hats.
I noticed that.
She didn't have glasses on, at 95. She didn't have a scrap of paper in her hand. And I remember very clearly, she said in one talk that she gave was, leaders are dreamers with shovels in their hand. Leaders are dreamers with shovels in their hand. And I think you just have to hang on to your vision, okay? Despite the disheartening slippage. You have to also realize that you can't influence everyone, there's some that you just cannot. But having done that, I said all of that, and I have to also sort of the caveat to all this, Maisha, is that I'm a workaholic. So the work is about who I am, and I don't tire easily. But I will say there are a couple of things that do replenish me, and it's important to have something that replenishes you, right? So for me, doing yoga, getting out and walking, exercising is one way that I can just completely shift gear. Many people, do this in the morning. I actually do it at the end of the day because I just need to kind of replenish myself. And then the second thing I'd say is, communities of support. I mean, I cannot say enough about, seek out your community of support. It takes a village, whether it's family or friends or the DEI community that, this racial justice community is incredibly, incredibly supportive. So seek out the community of support to help you, that people that can, share who, how they've handled things and support you. So let me stop there.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And it's great that you get a chance to do those things. I will not commiserate on being a workaholic. I'll just say, I understand, wink, wink. All right, we're going to turn it to some of our questions that are coming. We're
Awesome.
getting questions from many different sources, so we'll try to keep it organized here. We have a couple that I'm going to give you. Hold on, just trying to keep myself organized. Actually, I'm going to look at some of them are akin to some of the questions I've been thinking about anyway. So I will give you one that's about looking forward and about hope. What gives you hope about the future, Rohini, the future of DEI? What gives you hope about the future, and what opportunities are you most excited about right now when you think about DEI?
So, and I think that progress has been slow up until this point, but I think this is a different time. This is a different moment in time. Progress has been slow. Organizations have been flailing to do this work. Oftentimes, it's viewed as a series of incremental activities that are dispensable during crises. This happened during COVID. Budgets were slashed. There was a downsizing of DEI, and then you had the disparate impact of the pandemic on women and marginalized communities. You had systemic racism that was magnified by the murder of George Floyd that accelerated the need for organizations to double down and focus on DEI. So organizations, have been trying to figure things out, and many have been giving money for racial justice courses, $200 billion in the US alone, appointing positions, but obviously that's not enough, okay? But I'm hopeful, I'm really hopeful now, because I think Anne mentioned this, and I'm going to just echo what she said, that this is a time for transformation, not reckoning. And it's a different time, we're different now. And I do think that organizations are moving to that sort of, disrupting the status quo, and doing it in a way that this disruption of the status quo becomes a normalized part of the conversation in organizations. It's happening. At the individual level, we're adding social class. We're, all intersectional beings. We have intersectional identities. We're adding social class to the DEI discourse. And that's precisely what Ascend is doing through the family prosperity efforts, right? At the organization level, more and more organizations and leaders are audaciously eliminating harmful practices that favor some people, and they're disrupting the systems that have supported their success. It's these systems that are sort of tenacious because sometimes leaders don't recognize it, but more and more leaders are doing it. Organizations are taking unequivocal stands on injustice in their communities, such as voting rights. So I think this is work that's, each of us has to do this work. We have to be aware of our own awareness. Can I just, Maisha, in terms of capturing what gives me hope, can I just read a couple of lines that I just
Of course.
looked up? This
Yes.
is Amanda Gorman, who reflected on the delivery of her inaugural poem a year ago, okay? To me, this is what captures the hope. She says it far more eloquently than I can, but I think this is, fitting to share this. This past year for many has felt like a return to the same old gloom. Our nation is still haunted by disease, inequality, and environmental crises. But though our fears may be the same, we are not. If nothing else, this much be known: even as we've grieved, we've grown. Even fatigued, we've found that this hill we climb is one we must mount together. We are battered but bolder, worn but wiser. I'm not telling you to be tired or afraid. If anything, the fact that we're weary means we are by definition changed. We are brave enough to listen and learn from our fear. This time will be different, because this time we'll be different. We already are. So I think this time we are definitely different. And I'm very hopeful that this is a time for transformation, and individuals and organizations are leading the way. So.
Thank you so much for that, Rohini. Unfortunately, our time is just getting away from us, but I thought that was so appropriate. Thank you for sharing that. And if nothing else, words from Amanda Gorman and young people like her definitely give me hope. I'm going to ask if you have a call to action for us at all, and then I'm going to transition back. But is there just a short call to action that you want to give to the folks on the call?
Yeah, I mean, my call to action is basically, this transformation happens at the intersection of people and processes. It's work that's ongoing. It must be a personal and professional journey for each of us. And we each have to examine our own self-awareness, our inclusive behaviors and actions, and use ourselves as instruments of change. We can do it. Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of committed, passionate citizens can change the world.
The world.
Indeed, it is
That's
the
right.
only thing that ever has. And this is that group. We can do it.
Thank you so much, Rohini. I thank you on behalf of so many people who are doing this work. You've done it for so long, and I have so much to learn from you. I've learned a lot from you, and I thank you for your work and your commitment and for your presence today. And thank you all. I get the privilege of turning it back to Marjorie, and just want to say thank you to the Ascend team for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And thank you all. Marjorie.
Thank you so much, Maisha. And I just want to thank Rohini and Maisha for such a warm and wonderful conversation, really rich context. And Rohini, want to thank you for your leadership, which reflects both passion and purpose. So thank you for that. And thank you for gifting to us and the world your wisdom through your book, and also your deep commitment to the work that we're doing as part of the Family Prosperity Innovation community. And Maisha, I just can't tell you how deeply appreciative I am of you as a colleague and the work that you're doing and leading across the Institute to make certain that all Aspen Institute employees in our community feel a sense of belonging. So thank you for that. And as we close out, I just want to remind everyone that this conversation really has been an opportunity for you to learn about a very specific framework for doing this work well. The book that Dr. Anand has, shared with all of us in this talk really is about that framework. What we would like for you all to do as part of Ascend at the Aspen Institute, leading the Family Prosperity Innovation community, is to take another step. Take another step forward and make a commitment by considering and endorsing our employer principles. Many of you on the call are leading nonprofit organizations, sitting in positions of shaping employee benefits and policies, or you're in the private sector doing something similar. Our employer principles, and we'll put them in the chat again for you, are a way in which you can really center benefits and policies that support all workers, and particularly those that are parents. So please, this is about, going a little bit deeper on these issues and making a commitment, and appreciate if you will consider them. We're looking to have over 100 employers, both nonprofit as well as private sector employers, endorse the principles. And this conversation, I hope, is a spark that will help you do that. And then finally, in closing, I just want to thank my Ascend colleagues, Sarah and Lexi, who has led this work in partnership with others across the Ascend team. And then also really want to thank Anne for her leadership in all of this work. So with that, I will just close by another thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon for this conversation, which has been really rich. It's left me with a lot of thought and things to do. So thank you. Take care, everyone.